Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today for our live webinar, Enhancing Analytics with Machine Learning, How AI is Changing the Knowledge Game. My name is Melanie Turek, and I will be your presenter today. I am just going to go through a couple of quick housekeeping items, the most important of which to me is that you are aware of the question tool on your screen. I do welcome your questions throughout my presentation. If they're relevant to what I'm saying and I can fit in an answer while I'm speaking, I'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I will have a Q&A session at the end, and I'll try to get to them then. So please go ahead and post your questions as you think of them. Also, welcome comments, concerns, and any other feedback too as we go through this presentation. I am a VP of Research at Frost & Sullivan, and there I focus on what we kind of broadly call the area of connected work. So what that means is I'm really looking at kind of a broad range of markets and how companies, various organizations, the employees within them are dealing with all the things that we're kind of seeing change around us when it comes to the workplace today. So a lot of my focus is on communications and the customer experience, but I also spend a lot of time around mobility, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, and a whole bunch of other things in that general area. What we're seeing is that stuff is all starting to come together, so kind of have to pay attention to all of it at once. And what I want to do today is just go through a few of the kind of high-level areas that we're seeing around AI and machine learning, and make sure that you guys are, kind of aware of what's top of mind for some of your peers and where you should probably start focusing on in the next 12 to 18 months to make sure that you are staying competitive in your market and your sphere. What we are seeing, and our research is showing this, we throw out an annual survey of IT decision makers every year, and we talked to about 2,000 folks around the world, lots of different businesses, different size businesses, different geographies. And what we see is that almost 2/3 of them are telling us that they have already adopted AI and machine learning in some form, in some way, in their organizations today, and they intend to continue to do so certainly over the next several years. I'll get a little bit deeper into this research in just a minute, but those main drivers include improving the quality of the products and services that they're offering, the speed of the decision making that's happening within their organizations, and improving operating efficiencies. But they're also a little bit worried about some of the challenges that come with AI, and those specifically revolve around security, cost, and privacy. So I'll get into a little bit of those issues as well. We do see that it looks like companies in the IT and communications space, as well as finance, banking, and insurance, are the top industries that are implementing AI right now. And typically when we ask them why they're doing it, it's to facilitate innovation, get that competitive advantage, but they also have other reasons which we'll delve into too. And so what I want to do today is to spend a little bit of time talking about some of that research at a relatively high level. If you have questions and want some more specifics, feel free to reach out to me offline, and I can try to get you some more detailed information, but just kind of want to give everybody a quick look at sort of the state of the market today. And then talk a little bit about, what do we really mean by AI and machine learning? What are we actually seeing happening in the field, in the market, rather than just, what vendors, analysts like myself, the media are telling us is happening? Because sometimes there's a disconnect between, kind of the technology market and then sort of the boots on the ground, companies that are actually living and breathing this stuff every day. We'll look, as I said, at some of those risks and challenges and talk about some of the best ways to go ahead and get started with this stuff. So the most important thing to think about from the start of this conversation is, why is it happening, right? I mean, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, for example, that's a relatively broad term, but, basically what we mean is that we have a whole lot of connected devices that are collecting an awful lot of information and then applying algorithms to that information to come up with better outcomes, whatever those outcomes might be, depending on the context. And so all of that is driven by a couple of things. But the most important thing, the thing you cannot do without, is that connectivity, that underlying ability to integrate all of these devices, applications, and data in one place. And so what we see is that by next year, and this data is actually a little bit old, so we can update it just a bit, 80 billion connected devices might actually be closer to 100 billion. We're seeing about 5 billion internet users, 500 devices with unique digital IDs per square kilometer, and an awful lot of actual data that's being kind of promulgated out there and that we're really being able to leverage when we can. Now, all of these numbers are just going to continue to grow, right? So what we're finding is that, more and more organizations are giving their employees more and more devices. And by devices, what do I mean? I don't just mean computers and mobile phones. We're also talking about things like sensors and beacons, smart clothing, so service people who are out in the field who might have be wearing technology that is collecting and processing some of this information. Smart badges, as you walk around a facility, for example. And as I say, some of those kind of more static and almost hidden catalogers of information that are, kind of in your facilities, not necessarily moving, but picking up a lot of information. And so all of this is creating a world of data that then companies are hoping to use in order to improve, various processes and decisions. And if you think about it, Alexa is what I like to say is sort of the tip of the iceberg. So a lot of us are very familiar with some AI that's happening in our daily lives, just as consumers and just, people who are doing this on a personal level. So if you think about Alexa, and a lot of folks have Alexa today, well, what is Alexa really doing? Well, basically leveraging AI. And you hear a lot of those, sort of scary stories about what's happening with your data. The fact that, various companies are now eavesdropping on conversations. They're picking up all kinds of information that you're collecting. And certainly, there are some negatives to it on the consumer side. There are negatives to it on the corporate side as well. But the idea is very similar whether you're looking at business or consumer, right? The idea is we're using these tools and these technologies to help us in the things that we are trying to do on a day-to-day basis. So at home with Alexa, that might be trying to get more information about, a restaurant that you're going to that night, or a question that you have about somebody who played a part in a movie, or asking her to play your favorite songs while you're cooking dinner, or whatever it might be. Obviously, in the business world, it's more about understanding your customers better, recognizing that, a given specific individual customer has had X number of interactions with your organization, is generating an awful lot of revenue compared to other customers. On this particular problem, they have reached out in 5 different ways to get help, not all of which were into the contact center. Maybe one was on Twitter, maybe one was in a store, for example, and pulling all of that information together so that then the agent or the bot with whom that person is interacting in the moment can really leverage the information to deliver a much better customer experience. That's just one example. So as we move forward with AI and machine learning in the organizations and in the enterprise, sort of think about it like that. We're really trying to make processes better. We're trying to make our employees more productive and our products and services more valuable to our customers. So I mentioned that we have this annual study that we do, and I did want to talk a little bit about some of the findings that we've seen. This data actually isn't available right now. It's still sort of in the process of being published, so you're getting a really early first look at it. But it will be available soon. Somebody actually has asked online right now whether we will be making these slides available to attendees. And yes, they are going to be available, so you'll be able to have this first look data as well. So you can see, this is just sort of where are you when it comes to adopting some of these AI and machine learning technologies. And as I mentioned, IT and communications, banking and finance are very forward when it comes to this. But you can also see, interestingly, energy and utilities is right behind them. Not typically a vertical that is used to being a first adopter when it comes to technology, for example. But in this space, energy and utilities can see enormous benefit from leveraging AI, for example. And understanding usage patterns on the consumer side for their customers, to helping businesses adopt more green practices and policies within their organizations based on what is actually happening in that moment in time, right? So these things can save these businesses an awful lot of money and really help their customers out. You can see that down on the bottom, we've got a few business areas that are kind of lagging behind, but still, more than half of them are already using this technology today, which is a pretty significant adoption pattern considering how relatively new all of this stuff is as we're talking about it. And when we ask, well, why are you doing this? It definitely varies according to industry, so you can spend a little time with this data on your own later. But you can see, improving customer care takes a big hunk of people's priorities here, probably the biggest. And that's not unusual for new technologies today. A lot of businesses will deploy whatever it is that I'm talking about in any given day or any given week to improve that customer experience, because of course at the end of the day, without your customers, you don't have a business. So if something's going to be super valuable to your organization, if you can leverage it first to improve that interaction, you're probably going to see some pretty good ROI right off the bat. But we also see a lot of companies looking to create cost efficiencies. Again, pretty variable, I would say, within the markets. Interestingly, for example, if you look at something like wholesale, distribution, and logistics, that's not very top of mind for those businesses, which, frankly, if you ask me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because in those particular areas, in fact, there's an awful lot of room for creating cost efficiencies within distribution and logistics, for example. So some of this, I think, reflects just a kind of not yet fully understanding what this new technology can really do for a lot of organizations. So part of what we're hoping to do at Frost & Sullivan is better educate the market overall into where some of those benefits really lie. When we look at where companies are when it comes to implementation, and this is pretty important to get a sense of just how mature this technology is, maybe from your perspective, how far behind or far ahead you might be compared to your peers. You can see, the majority of organizations are either in the trial phase or are kind of in that early implementation, which typically means that they've gone through that trial and now they're starting to spread the technology out throughout the company. Not too many are in that enterprise-wide implementation stage yet. Interestingly here, the one that really pops out is government. Right? Again, not typically an area that you see deploying new technology with gusto and being on the forefront of these kinds of things. But in this area of AI, we're really seeing government organizations pick up on it. And I'll get into a little bit more about that in just a bit. Some other, I think, places to note here, if you look at, say, travel and hospitality, still a lot of proof of concept stuff going on there, for example. It's very interesting to me to see that, because travel and hospitality is actually an area where I think AI can serve a huge boost in terms of, say, generating loyalty, having repeat business, really personalizing stays, where that personalization matters a lot more than it does on, say, an online buying experience kind of thing. So I think, that's an industry that really needs to step it up a little bit when it comes to these tools. And again, when we look at the reasons for investing in AI and machine learning, I mentioned as we aggregate these, what some of these are. Improving the quality of your products and services, definitely top of mind for most businesses. Then followed by speed of decision making, so within the organization, being able to make those decisions faster. Typically that's going to mean finding ways around those really lengthy approval processes that we also love, and then gaining overall operating efficiencies internally. What's really interesting to me is that you don't see a lot of concern here for saving money. didn't even make it onto this list. And that's really important because it's a big shift in how we think about deploying technology. Traditionally, a lot of organizations think about deploying new technology as a cost saver first and foremost. And when it comes to something like AI, that's really the wrong way to think about it. Now, that's not to say that it can't save money. It absolutely can. But it really shouldn't be your first driver, right? Improving processes, ultimately, obviously, to increase those revenues is really where you want to go with these technologies. Now, I mentioned, a lot of companies have some concerns around these tools. Security risks, obviously, the biggest. That's not unusual, frankly. If we are surveying IT decision makers about just about any technology, they're going to tell us that security risks are a big one for them. But of course, when it comes to data, and then using that data in some fashion, that's actually, a very relevant concern. And if you think about it, it goes well beyond, just your typical securing your information from hacking, from bad actors, from fraud, that kind of thing, to really understanding where your data resides, what kinds of applications are going to have access to it, and what kinds of people are going to have access to it. And one of the things that AI and machine learning does is it introduces a lot of complexity in those areas. Because very often, historically, if you had customer data, it resided in maybe a couple of places, probably your CRM system. Maybe that was tied to a broader sales management system, and it probably is in your contact center. And very often, as I say, you get all of those applications from one vendor. It's sort of all in the same general database, whether that's in the cloud or on-prem. But what we're seeing when it comes to AI and machine learning is the best companies are recognizing that they need to take that information that resides in, say, those siloed applications and start to leverage it across the organization. So you might be able to take trends that you're learning, for example, from your customer behavior and apply that to your R&D. And think about, how is that going to change the products and the services that I come out with in the next, 12 months? Well, suddenly you're taking that data and putting it into a different store. And so now, those security and privacy issues become a little bit more complex and a little bit more risky. So we really do need to be thinking about that a lot. Another big thing here is cost of integration, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that integration process and why it's so important. Again, siloed information is good, but it's not the best, right? The gold standard here is to be able to use data across different applications, across different business processes, lines of business, and ultimately end users. And so as you do that, you need to think about integrating the applications, integrating the, kind of where everything is residing, integrating all of those security processes and protocols, and integrating the usage as well. So that can be very complex, and it can be kind of costly as well. Now, when we ask companies why are they doing this, what are their top business goals for 2019 to 2020, overall, you can see improving that customer experience is definitely important, as is improving operational efficiencies and launching new products and services. So, what's top of mind for these folks is also very well aligned with why they are deploying AI. And that's a good thing to see because typically what it means is they think that this new technology can really help them out in this area. But an interesting thing that we like to do is look at the difference between the thinking among CEOs versus, say, CTOs or CIOs, right? What is the business thinking versus what is the technology side of the organization thinking when it comes to using these tools? And when we look at their priorities, you can see some pretty stark differences. So to me, very interesting is that the IT department is more interested in improving that customer experience, for example, than the CEO. The CEO is more interested in improving operational efficiencies than IT. To me, that wouldn't be intuitive. I mean, I would have guessed, perhaps, that those numbers would be opposite, would be flipped. So, as you look through some of this, I encourage you to think about your role in the company, right, if you're in IT or if you're in business, and how does it align to some of these. But also, as you need to start to bring in stakeholders, and you're going to have to talk to somebody in the C-suite, and probably both, somebody at the CEO level and somebody at the CTO or CIO level, or at least within those offices. And as you do, you can think about, well, what are their priorities versus, their colleagues versus perhaps my own. So this can be a very useful way to think about, how do I sell my need for this, as I go forward with these technologies. And then when we look at the impact on various departments, this is also, I think, really interesting when it comes to kind of prioritizing where do you want to launch your AI initiatives, and how, again, do you want to try to get budget for it. Sales and marketing are very high up when it comes to the impact that digital transformation has on departments. That's followed, again, by product management, accounting and finance, and then you can see some areas down below. Now, this is sometimes a little bit of kind of circular thing, a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, because if sales and marketing is aggressive about deploying these tools, then they're going to see the biggest impact, the biggest advantage. If HR typically doesn't get a whole lot of budget and a whole lot of resources, even when it comes to technology, well, then they're not going to see as big an impact. So, you do have to think about, like, what is important to my business? Where am I really trying to improve things? And then, how can I make sure that the technology impacts that? So now I just want to get into a little bit of, why are we talking about this? What are we really able to do today? What are we hoping to be able to do tomorrow? And, I mentioned that connectivity is such a huge part of this, but of course, so is data, right? So you can't really have AI without the connection, but you then need the data to inform all of your decisions, to populate all those algorithms, to make sure that you're getting the information and the actions that you need as a result. And real-time data is kind of the first step, right? It's what's super important to be able to make transitions in the moment, to be very agile, to react very quickly to changes in your market. That might be happening, depending on your industry, on like a minute-to-minute or hour-to-hour basis, or they might be a little bit farther out. You might be talking about forecasting. But it is also really important to think about not real-time data, right? Say historical data, or again, future data, as if you will. For example, forecasting, weather, depending on the industry you're in, or purchasing habits or buying patterns over the upcoming Christmas season or back-to-school season or whatever it might be. And the key here is really being able to merge those two things. And, that can be a challenge, and that can be tricky in this space, because very often a lot of systems are designed to deal with one or the other. We can deal with real-time data, no problem. We can deal with historical data, no problem. But getting those two things together to act in concert and to kind of have equal value but not necessarily equal impact in any given situation, that's where the complexity really comes in. And so that's really where you're looking for a partner, maybe a vendor, maybe professional services, maybe both, to really help you navigate that intersection, because that's very important. And if you think about this, I like to think about AI as sort of rethinking what we call the Pareto principle, the idea that about 80% of outcomes are driven by about 20% of inputs, so whatever that is. So about 80% of your customer interactions or time that you spend, for example, on customer support are going to come from about 20% of your customer base. A more positive way to look at it is about 80% of your revenue is going to come from about 20% of your customer base. So that's the kind of historic classic Pareto principle idea. But what we see when we start to leverage AI and we really dig into the data, especially as it comes in, over time, and as we can sort of see various spans across geographies and different businesses, is that, in fact, that 80-20 ratio is wrong. It's a lot narrower than that in a lot of cases. And my favorite example is actually in the video gaming industry, where 1/4% of all video gamers contribute about 90% of all revenues to that industry. So that 0.25% of gamers is really, really important to the industry. And so even taking an 80-20 approach is not really narrow enough to see a significant impact on the bottom line. And what AI does is it allows us to do two things here. To get that number, to get that understanding, okay, who is actually contributing to this, whether it's a positive like revenue or a negative, like support costs, for example. And then, how do we rethink and restructure the way we deal with those people, and not necessarily on an individual level, but as a group, to either improve those numbers or to mitigate them, right, depending on whether they're positive or negative. So, that's one of the ways in which AI is really important to start thinking about, like how we can narrow that typical 80-20 rule. And no matter how you look at it, the important thing here is that the customer really is king. And so what we're really trying to do is continuously reach out to our customers and help them understand that we as companies do know who they are. We do understand their value to our organization. And we do have a pretty good sense of how we can help them, right? Whether we're retailers or educators, government agencies, manufacturers, it doesn't really matter. The point is they expect customized, personalized interactions, and we want to be able to give those to them. And what's really interesting, of course, is this just becomes more and more important over time, because what technology has done is made it awfully easy for those customers to switch. So if they don't feel like they're getting a great experience from us, it's really easy for them to go somewhere else, and they know that. I mean, customers today know that they have the knowledge and they have the power. And so we want to make sure that as we start to develop AI, if it's in the contact center or if it's in a different part of our business, that at the end of the day, what we're doing is really driving very data-rich, very personalized interactions. But I would also encourage you to think about this from the employee perspective as well. So it's not just customers who are expecting that personalization and that customization. More and more employees are going to want it and need it too. And so there's sort of going to be, I would say, almost an increasing sort of blurring of lines, if you will, between how you think about your customers and how you think about your employees, and finding ways to leverage, what you're doing that's working in one area in the other area. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So one thing we're seeing too is that sales and marketing are migrating, right, to digital and mobile. And so what this does is it tells us that AI is really going to be accepted in this environment. And that's one of the pushbacks that we get sometimes is, well, you're talking about personalization and customization, but for that human touch, aren't I going to lose it if I deploy AI in my organization? We've all been online and needed to interact with customer service and had a chatbot pop up, and when it's a machine. I mean, a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, right, it just doesn't really pass the Turing test. And so getting that fixed and making sure that we're able to, make those interactions more real is very important. But so is the understanding that we as consumers, as employees, have a lot of tolerance for those machine interactions if they are accurate, if they are really recognizing what we are asking, if they have access to understanding, for example, our past interactions with the organization, so that we don't have to repeat information. We don't have to explain the context, right? That's all understood. At that point, it doesn't really matter to us if we're dealing with a machine or a human being, if in the end we're getting that personalized, customized interaction. So a couple examples of how we're doing this and kind of what we're seeing at Frost & Sullivan when we work with our clients in this space. I'll start with the supply chain and kind of redefining the supply chain. So, just-in-time Supply chains have been around now for several decades, certainly the holy grail of supply chains for a very long time. The idea being you're only producing what you know you need, what you know you can sell, which means you're also only consuming the materials and other resources that you need in order to hit those production quotas. And of course, typically up until very recently, we've been able to do that pretty much with historical data. So you have a pretty good understanding of how things have trended, how they've worked in the past. You can look at what's coming up in the relatively near future. You can make educated guesses. And some supply chain systems have been designed to try, to move in real time and adjust as needed. But until you actually have that real-time data coming into those systems, which is what we're starting to see now, and then being able to apply AI algorithms that can operate, so fast, that humans just simply couldn't mimic it, that's really where you start to see the benefit here, because it can impact how you manage everything from procurement to production, So if, for example, you're a manufacturing organization and, historically you're expecting to produce a certain amount of widgets over, Q4, and then it turns out that, there's a global event that is either going to increase or decrease demand for your product, and it happens on a Saturday afternoon. Well, typically in the past there wasn't much you could do about that except, freak out, go into the office on Monday and start to make adjustments. But with AI, what's happening is that information is getting fed into the system, and the algorithms are immediately making adjustments, and they're sending that information to all of the other systems that are part of your procurement and production and ultimately distribution line. But then they're also able to respond to changes after the fact. So if it turns out that the event wasn't as bad as you expected it to be, and you start to see that a few days or a few weeks out, the system will get that information before you do. Because as orders start to pick up again, or as changes on the ground start to happen, it sees them before you do, really, and is able to adapt on the fly. And so that's the goal, And then it can send out updated orders for materials and updated staffing information and updated, production timelines and estimates based on those real-time changes. So really some interesting opportunities here within that supply chain to literally act on the fly and reacting not just to what's happening within your own facility or within your own customer orders, but actually outside the world and seeing how those broader trends are likely going to impact what you're doing. In accounting and finance, one of the big areas in how we rethink risk, how we look at modernizing the way you think about risk. So, historically, again, risk analysis has been something that is often confined to certain, data geeks who spend all their time looking at information and assessing risk and, then helping the C-suite make decisions about new markets to enter or different things, different ways to handle certain events. Certainly there are industries like insurance and banking where, risk is pretty much the whole business. But this applies to all organizations, you're always managing risk at some level. And what AI and machine learning allows you to do is think about risk less as a threat and how do you mitigate that threat, How do you minimize it? And more as a balance between threat and opportunity. Because at the end of the day, the companies that can take on just enough risk to get a competitive advantage are the ones that are going to be most successful, Taking on risk is actually a very good thing if it breaks your way. It's only a bad thing if it doesn't. And so the more information you can get to help it break your way, the more successful you're going to be as an organization. But of course, doing that, in human time with generally historic or static information is one thing. Doing it on computer time with algorithms that are constantly learning and changing based on up-to-the-second information is something else. So it changes the way we think about risk. It changes the way we analyze risk, and can be very, very significant for both companies within those industries and also companies across industries, but within, say, their accounting and finance departments. And what are we doing here when we think about some use cases, right? I talked about, for example, at the beginning, all of the connected devices and how we're not just talking about PCs and mobile phones. We're talking about all kinds of feedback and collection mechanisms. So if you think about in a production facility, we're talking about smart badges that show you quite literally where your employees are at any given time, where they are on the line, are they on their break, what are they doing when they're on the line. And I don't mean to get super big brothery here. I mean, the goal isn't really to spy on people. The goal is to sort of see how are people operating right within the facility, and how can we maximize their productivity based on that information. But we're also looking at things like environmental and biometric feedback. So again, within an office environment or within a manufacturing environment, what is the temperature of that facility, and how does that change the way people operate, the way people interact? How does that affect the actual production of what we're doing itself, for example? Similar to biometric feedback. Really interesting ways to see, for example, how workers on a line, how their productivity changes depending on the time of day and how that affects their own bodies, right? Do they see spikes in temperature? Do their bodies tend to slump? Is it harder for them to stay focused? And so the more information you have about this, the better you're able to schedule and position those employees in ways that are going to keep them productive. And that doesn't mean treating them like robots. It might, in fact, mean recognizing that, giving those people 15-minute breaks, every hour and a half, which sounds like crazy, is actually going to lead to higher productivity, right, than giving them no breaks or, one break or as mandated by federal law, but you're not going to do anything more than that. So it's a really interesting way to think about, how are we really operating at peak efficiency, given that we do have human beings, in our operations, for example. Another way we're looking at things here is there's a very large retailer that's looking at how it stocks shelves and sort of lays out items, and this is a grocery retailer, right? And so understanding a couple of things, understanding when we need to restock and where we need to do that and how we need to do that based on both the historic and traditional ways of looking at things, which is just sort of understanding what happened this time of year for the last 10 years, but also the real-time data, right? What is actually going on in my store right now? And then understanding, how that's going to affect both how I stock what's out in the store, but also then how I order and procure more as I need it coming in. But even more interestingly, I think, is also understanding the layout of a store. So for example, seeing that at a certain time, people are buying, two things together all the time. So just as an example, they're always buying milk and eggs, right, together. And then as a store deciding, okay, well, I'm going to then place my milk and eggs at opposite ends of that facility so that people have to walk through the store in order to get the two things I know they came in for, and maybe there'll be some more impulse purchases. Or you might do that and then see that, in fact, not only does that not lead to more impulse purchases, but it seems like now your sales of milk and eggs are dropping off because, in fact, people say, I don't want to go to that store to get my milk and eggs because I have to walk 100 feet, extra just to do my shopping. And so you realize that, well, that sounded good on paper. I'm trying to trick my customers into buying more stuff. But in reality, it didn't work. So getting that kind of immediate feedback is really, really interesting when it comes to AI and machine learning. And finally, a really new example that is from United Airlines. And they recently deployed technology that allows them to decide when and whether to hold flights. And so, we all know that typically, right, gate closes 10 minutes before And if you arrive there 30 seconds after that gate closed, well, you're just stuck. And if you had, a really tight connection and your pretty earlier flight was late, we've all been there on the plane, right, trying to get off, and maybe we can run, and maybe we can make it, and will they hold it for us? And we never really know. Well, the truth is the airline never really knew either, right? They typically didn't hold flights, and they typically just took off, and they didn't give it much thought or attention. And aside from annoying, the customers who were affected in that moment, it turns out it actually wasn't very operationally smart either, right? Because it caused a lot of problems for them as the day progressed. And so what United is doing now, and they've rolled this out, and it's been in operation for several months, that they haven't done a lot of messaging around it, which I find sort of interesting. But basically what they're doing is they're looking at every single flight, and they're able to say, okay, we need to hold this flight because we have 25 connections coming in, and they're all late, but if we don't hold the flight for them, it's actually going to have a more negative impact, right, on our operations downstream than if we do hold the flight. So we're holding this one. Or we're looking at the wins, and we can see that we will make up the time if we hold this flight. So it's only 3 people, but it's not going to impact our operations at all because we're going to make up that time, and we're still going to arrive on time if we hold that flight 15 minutes. And meanwhile, those 3 people, we don't have to deal with them, and also they're still happy. So there are lots and lots of different inputs that they're looking at to make these decisions. And the decisions are not being made by people, they're being made by the algorithms. And so the customer service agents don't have to think about this. The pilots don't have to think about this. The customers don't have to think about this. It's all being done in the back end with AI and machine learning, and then those customers and those gate agents are getting that information in real time through their apps and their phones and what have you. And then they're being able, to act accordingly, right? So, that's something where it's like it affects everybody, and it's this really cool thing. And it's great that United and hopefully other airlines, are starting to see that we can really do this. So just to sort of sum up here, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is using real-time data to improve our outcomes, whatever those outcomes might be. And finally, I always like to wrap up with sort of a call to action because, a lot of times with technology budgets, obviously, we know they're tight, and it can be very hard to get permission to deploy these kinds of tools, especially when it might be hard to create a direct line from, deploying AI to, say, cost savings where you can show the ROI, in some number of weeks or months or what have you. But what we find through our research is that organizations that identify themselves as early adopters of IT solutions also show, stronger revenue growth, and they also show higher margins. So no matter how you measure, that economic success, they are definitely seeing it more than the laggards. So with that, I'll wrap up the kind of presentation part of this, and just let you know that I did have a few questions come in, and I will get to that. But I did want to also encourage you to please ask questions if you have them. I'm going to take a few for looking at the clock, just a couple minutes here. I like to try to give you guys a little more time in your hour. Yeah, with that, I'll go ahead and get started. The first question is, somebody says, well, you talk about customer service being top of mind, but also product and services development. So where should I start with AI? And kind of the short answer to that is, I would say it depends on, more than anything else, probably the industry that you're in. So we saw some of the data showing, for example, that distribution and logistics is not really deploying this as sort of aggressively as some other industries. But obviously for them, the place to start is in fact probably in those back office capabilities rather than perhaps in the customer-facing capabilities. The United Airlines example that I gave you, for example, it's not about the customer experience directly. In other words, that's not a contact center application per se. But of course, in doing what they're doing around logistics, and they're moving people, not things, but still it's logistics, will have an enormous impact on that customer experience. So depending on the business that you're in, you might start out thinking, okay, well, the bulk of my business is literally selling something to a customer, so that's where I'm going to start. But if that isn't the bulk of your business, then you might want to start thinking about it somewhere else within, ERP or supply chain management or whatever it might be. And sort of related to that, I have a question from someone asking, what is the technology involved here? Are we talking about like out-of-the-box applications? And I mean, again, the answer is yes, but what we're really seeing is that more and more vendors are including AI capabilities within their existing, software and services. So it's not so much that you're going to be able to go out and like purchase artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's not really a thing. But what you want to make sure that you're doing is purchasing applications that can support and help you initiate those AI efforts. Now, where this gets complicated, quite frankly, is in that integration part that I talked about earlier. So you could imagine a scenario in which your contact center team is starting to use AI in the contact center, and they're doing it through their contact center vendor. Your sales and marketing teams are using it through, their Salesforce and marketing automation technology. And, your accounting and finance department is doing it right through their accounting and finance applications. Well, that's great for them as individual business units. But then ultimately, of course, as I mentioned, you want to start to integrate some of that information and integrate some of those actions. And that's where things get tricky. So it can be that you might need to either reach out to a large-scale platform vendor or a professional services provider, very often the same thing, in order to start thinking about that integration and how you're going to get, data and algorithmic action across, lots of different siloed applications. And then this next question, I'm just looking at the clock, I think it'll be our last one, actually says, you mentioned earlier that there can be pushback when it comes to AI because of personalization. And my boss is really reluctant to give up that personal experience. We're, I think, a relatively small company and don't really want to give that up. And I understand that. But one thing I always say to that is, a long, long time ago, kind of at the start of my career, I worked for a publishing organization, and I was on the editorial side of things. And on the editorial side of things, we had a receptionist, and so people would call, and if we weren't at our desks, the receptionist would answer the call, take down a message on paper, and give it to us or somehow get it to us. And it was a terrible system because the receptionist was overwhelmed. She wasn't actually all that good at her job. We would get these sort of garbled messages. They weren't complete. Sometimes you couldn't even read the phone number, the name. It was a really terrible system. On the other hand, the publishing side of the organization, the sales side, every salesperson had an admin. And so those people got their messages all the time, and they were clear and very useful and very helpful. And so when voicemail came into the enterprise, so I'm really dating myself here, the editorial side said, we need this. We need this thing called voicemail because now we'll be able to actually get our messages. And, they're keeping us from being able to do our jobs, right? And the sales side said, no, we're going to lose that personal connection. That's our business. Our livelihood is on those personal relationships. We cannot give that up. It took us a year to get voicemail into that organization. And this was one of the biggest magazines at the time, millions and millions and millions of subscribers. It took us almost a year. But of course, once it happened, right, it didn't take very long for everybody to embrace it. On the editorial side, of course, it meant that we actually got our messages. So the personalization thing was irrelevant because we weren't, we weren't getting the information we needed in the first place. It didn't matter whether it was personal or not. On the sales side, they still had their admins. They still had that personalization, but as a backup, they also had this great voicemail system. And the two started to interplay, and the admin started to take on an even better and bigger and more valuable role, right, than just answering the phone. And so that's what happens with technology. It's always a change. It's always a shift. And with AI, it's definitely a change and a shift. And it can feel impersonal. But in fact, if what it's doing is allowing you to A, initiate and complete the process that you intend to do in the first place, which in a lot of organizations is really broken, and B, ultimately make that a more personal and customized experience. Even if you're taking the human being out of the equation or partly out of the equation, you are still ending up better than where you started. So with that, I'll finish things up. If you do have questions, you see my contact information there. Please feel free to reach out to me. And again, thank you very much for attending today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday and a really great weekend.